Dad yelled, "You're no son of mine." So I packed my bags and vanished, but I returned as the man who. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to subscribe and drop a comment below telling us where you're listening from. We'd love to give you a shout out in our next video. I always knew my father was a man who measured worth in achievements he could see. If you didn't make money, build an empire, or command respect, you were nothing in his eyes. Growing up, I learned that lesson in 1,000 little ways. Every time he dismissed my small victories or cut me down with a single glare. But nothing prepared me for the night he decided to erase me from his life altogether. It was late, almost midnight, when the argument finally exploded. We'd been circling around it for months, my refusal to join the family business, his constant reminders that I was squandering my life. I'd come home from my job at the hardware store, tired and smelling of sawdust, only to find him pacing the living room with a scowl etched deep into his face. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "You're a disgrace," he said, his voice low but steady. "All those years I put food on this table, and you repay me by playing handyman in some cheap shop." I opened my mouth to speak, but the words stuck in my throat. My chest felt tight, like all the oxygen had been sucked out of the room. He saw my hesitation as weakness, and he pounced. "Don't look at me like that," he snapped. "You think I don't see it? You're nothing but a coward, afraid of real work, real responsibility." I wanted to tell him that what I did mattered, that fixing things, even small things, gave me a sense of purpose he could never understand. But I knew it was pointless. My father had always been deaf to anything that didn't echo his own pride. So I did the only thing I could. I stood up straight and looked him in the eye. "I'm done trying to prove myself to you," I said, my voice trembling but firm. "I'm done." For a moment, he just stared at me, like he couldn't believe what he'd heard. Then his face twisted into a mask of fury. "You're no son of mine," he roared, the words slamming into me like a physical blow. "Get out of my house. And don't you ever come back." Silence fell in the room, so thick I could hear my own heartbeat. My mother, who had been standing near the doorway, turned away, her shoulders hunched in defeat. I realized then that there would be no last-minute plea, no gentle voice telling him to calm down. This was final. I didn't say another word. I walked upstairs and packed my bag in the same room where I'd grown up, a room still covered in faded posters from my teenage years. My hands moved mechanically, folding shirts and stuffing them into a duffel bag I hadn't used in years. I didn't bother taking much, just enough to get by for a few days. My childhood trophies, the ones I'd clung to like proof that I had value, I left them behind. They were meaningless to him, and now they were meaningless to me too. As I zipped up the bag and turned to leave, I paused at the doorway. One last look around the room that had been my whole world once. The memories were there, but they felt like they belonged to someone else, someone who still believed that love could be earned if you tried hard enough. I carried the bag downstairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. My father was still standing in the living room, his arms crossed, his jaw set. He didn't say another word, and neither did I. I just walked past him, out the door, and into the cold night. The air outside was sharp and biting, and I felt it cut through the thin fabric of my jacket. I kept walking, past the cracked sidewalks and the flickering street lamps, my breath coming in small, ragged clouds. I didn't have a destination in mind, just away from the suffocating weight of his disappointment, away from the life I'd been told was the only way to measure success. When I reached the edge of town, I found a small motel with a neon sign buzzing above the entrance. "Vacancy," it promised in flickering red letters. It felt almost mocking, like it was telling me there was always a room for the lost and the broken. I handed over what little cash I had and took a key from the bored clerk who didn't bother to look me in the eye. The room smelled of stale cigarettes and mildew. I didn't care. I dropped my bag by the door and sank onto the edge of the bed, feeling the springs creak under my weight. My hands were shaking. I told myself it was just the cold, but I knew better. I was scared, more scared than I'd ever been in my life. I lay back on the bed, staring up at the stained ceiling tiles, and thought about what my father had said. You're no son of mine. The words echoed in my head, each repetition a fresh cut. I tried to tell myself that it didn't matter, that his words didn't define me. But in that moment, it felt like they did. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, heard his voice. But as the hours dragged on and the first pale light of dawn crept through the curtains, something inside me shifted. Maybe it was the exhaustion, or maybe it was the fact that I had nothing left to lose. But I realized that I didn't have to carry his anger any longer. I could let it go. I sat up, took a deep breath, and looked around the shabby room. It wasn't much, but it was mine, at least for the night. And for the first time in my life, I understood that maybe that was enough. When I woke up that morning, the world outside the cracked window was pale and quiet. The kind of dawn that doesn't promise anything except the chance to try again. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, just listening to the low hum of traffic in the distance and the faint drip of water from the bathroom sink. I thought about how easily my life had been reduced to this small, musty room. No home, no family, just me and the choices I had yet to make. I didn't have much money left. What little cash I had was enough to cover one more night in the motel, maybe a few cheap meals if I stretched it. I knew I couldn't stay there forever, but for that morning, I let myself linger in the warmth of the blankets. My father's words still echoed in my mind, but they felt fainter now, like a radio station just out of range. I took comfort in that. I showered in water that ran either scalding hot or ice cold, scrubbing away the grime of the previous day like it might also wash away the doubt clinging to my skin. When I looked at my reflection in the mirror, I barely recognized the man staring back. My eyes looked older, harder, but there was something else too, a flicker of determination, faint but steady. I dressed in the same clothes from the night before, rolling up the sleeves of my work shirt like I had somewhere important to be. I didn't, but it felt better to pretend. I packed up my bag, slinging it over my shoulder, and stepped out into the chill morning air. The streets were still empty, the town not yet awake. I walked aimlessly at first, just to keep moving, my breath rising in small clouds in front of me. Every step felt like a small act of defiance, a refusal to curl up and disappear. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't go back. I passed a diner on the corner, its sign promising hot coffee and warm smiles. It looked old and a little battered, but the smell of frying bacon and fresh bread made my stomach clench. I hesitated at the door, hand hovering over the handle. Part of me wanted to turn away, to keep walking until my legs gave out. But hunger had a way of drowning out pride. Inside, the diner was bright and crowded with the kind of people who knew how to survive on tips and determination. A waitress with tired eyes and a kind smile nodded at me as I slid into a booth near the window. She set a chipped mug of coffee in front of me without a word, and I wrapped my hands around it like it was the only source of warmth left in the world. I ordered the cheapest thing on the menu, toast and eggs, no sides. I ate slowly, savoring every bite like it was a feast. As I watched the cook move around the small kitchen, flipping pancakes and calling out orders, I saw a sign taped to the register. Help wanted dishwasher. It felt like fate, or maybe just the next step in a long climb back to something that felt like dignity. When the waitress came back to refill my coffee, I asked about the sign. She gave me a long look, like she was trying to decide if I was worth the trouble. Then she shrugged. You can start tomorrow, if you're serious, she said. It's not much, but it's something. I told her I was serious. I didn't tell her that I didn't have a choice. She handed me a slip of paper with a time scrawled on it. 6 a.m. sharp. Don't be late, she said. Her voice was gentle, but there was steel in it. I nodded, pocketing the paper like it was a lifeline. I spent the rest of the day wandering the small town, looking for a place that might rent a room by the week. The cheapest option was a boarding house near the old train tracks, a place where the walls were thin and the air smelled faintly of oil and rust. I paid the landlord in cash, watching his eyes flick over the bills like he was weighing their worth against the trouble I might bring. The room was small and plain, just a narrow bed, a battered dresser, and a single window that looked out over the tracks. But it was mine, at least for now. I dropped my bag on the floor and sat on the edge of the bed, feeling the springs groan under my weight. I could still hear my father's voice in the back of my mind, telling me I'd never make it on my own. But for the first time, I didn't flinch. That night, I lay awake, listening to the distant rumble of freight trains passing by. Each one sounded like a promise, a reminder that the world was still moving, even if I felt stuck. I thought about the diner, about the sink full of dishes and the steam rising from the dishwater. It wasn't the life my father had mapped out for me, but it was a start. And for the first time in a long while, that felt like enough. I realized then that maybe this was what freedom really looked like, not the grand gestures or the bright lights of success, but the quiet, stubborn refusal to give up. It was the choice to keep going, even when everything in you wanted to stop. It was the choice to build something out of the wreckage of everything you'd lost. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but I knew that when the sun rose again, I'd be there, ready to scrub those dishes until my hands were raw, to carve out a place for myself in a world that had never made room for me before. And in that small, cold room, with the night pressing in around me and the future still uncertain, I made a promise to myself. I would never let anyone, especially my father, define who I was again. From that night on, I would measure my worth by my own standards, even if no one else ever saw it. The next morning, I woke before the alarm went off, the sky outside still wrapped in a blanket of soft gray. My mind was sharp with the weight of what I had to do, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of purpose. I washed up quickly in the tiny sink at the boarding house, splashing cold water on my face to chase away the last traces of doubt. I dressed in my cleanest clothes, still wrinkled and worn from the night before, but they would have to do. I arrived at the diner before the doors had even unlocked. The cook, a stocky man with a tired smile, grunted a greeting as he let me in. "Name's Henry," he said, his voice as rough as the calluses on his hands. "You're the new dishwasher, right? Let's see what you're made of." He led me to the back of the diner, where the air was thick with steam and the clatter of plates echoed off the walls. The sinks were already piled high with dishes from the breakfast rush, streaks of grease and leftover eggs crusting the plates. The smell was a mix of stale coffee, soap, and sweat, an aroma of honest work, if nothing else. Henry handed me a pair of cracked rubber gloves and a dish rag. "It's not glamorous," he said, eyeing me like he expected me to flinch, "but it keeps the place running. You ready?" I nodded, even though my stomach churned at the thought of plunging my hands into that grimy water. But there was no room for hesitation. I rolled up my sleeves and plunged in, scrubbing away at plates that looked like they hadn't seen soap in years. The water was hot enough to sting, and within minutes, my fingers felt like they were turning to prunes. At first, the work felt endless. Every time I thought I was catching up, another stack of plates would appear, fresh from the busy breakfast crowd. My arms ached, and sweat dripped down my forehead, but I kept at it. I thought of my father's face, the way his lips twisted in disgust whenever he talked about lowly work. I thought of the nights I'd spent under his roof, never feeling like I was enough. And with every scrub, every plate that came clean, I felt a little of that weight slip away. The other staff didn't say much to me at first. They were too busy hustling orders and refilling coffee cups, their faces set in lines of quiet determination. But as the hours dragged on, I caught small glimpses of camaraderie, shared jokes between the waitresses, a pat on the back from Henry when I finally cleared the first mountain of dishes. It wasn't much, but it was more kindness than I'd seen in weeks. By noon, my shoulders were on fire, and my fingers were raw from the soap and hot water. But there was something satisfying about it, too. The steady rhythm of scrubbing and rinsing, the way the plates came out clean and gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights, it was proof that I could make something better, even if it was just a stack of dishes. During a short lull in the rush, the waitress who'd hired me, her name was Maggie, I learned, brought me a plate of scrambled eggs and toast, balanced on her hip like she'd been doing it her whole life. "You look like you could use this," she said, sliding the plate onto the edge of the sink. On the house. Don't let Henry see, though. He's a stickler for the rules. I wanted to refuse, to keep my pride intact, but my stomach betrayed me with a loud growl. I nodded my thanks and wolfed the food down in quick bites, the warmth of it filling me up in a way that went deeper than my empty belly. Thanks, I said, my voice quiet but sincere. Maggie just smiled, her eyes crinkling at the corners. You're doing fine, she said. Better than most new guys. It wasn't much, but it felt like a lifeline, a small moment of connection in a world that had felt cold and indifferent for so long. I held on to that as I went back to work, letting the hot water and the steady scrape of dishes become a kind of meditation. By the time the last lunch plate had been washed and stacked away, the diner was quiet again, the afternoon sun slanting in through the greasy windows. My back ached, and my hands were red and raw, but I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: satisfaction. It wasn't pride exactly. More like a quiet certainty that I was still here, still standing, no matter how low I'd fallen. Henry clapped me on the shoulder as he passed by, his heavy hand landing with a thud. Not bad for your first day, he said gruffly. Come back tomorrow. Same time. I nodded, too tired to say much, but inside, I felt a spark of something fierce and alive. This wasn't the life my father had wanted for me, but it was mine. Mine to shape, mine to endure. And for the first time, that felt like enough. As I walked back to the boarding house, the cold evening air stung my cheeks, but I didn't mind. The weight of the day settled into my bones, but it felt different, earned, instead of imposed. My mind kept drifting back to the diner, to the steam and the sweat and the quiet satisfaction of honest work. I thought of my father again, but his voice didn't seem so loud anymore. Maybe he'd never understand what it meant to build a life from the ground up, to find dignity in the cracks and stains of the world. Maybe he didn't have to. This life, these small triumphs, I realized they didn't need his approval to be real. That night, as I lay on the narrow bed in my rented room, I let the exhaustion wash over me like a wave. My hands were sore, my body heavy, but my heart felt lighter than it had in years. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but I knew one thing for certain: I wasn't done yet. The road ahead was still long and uncertain, but I was ready to face it, dish by dish, step by step. And that, I decided, was enough for me to keep going. The weeks at the diner blurred together, each day beginning before dawn and ending when the last crumb had been swept away. My hands, once soft and smooth, turned rough and cracked from the endless hot water and harsh soap. At night, I'd lay in bed, feeling every ache in my arms and shoulders. But there was a comfort in that pain. It meant I was moving, I was building something, even if it was only one clean plate at a time. I worked quietly, never complaining, always showing up on time. The diner became my little corner of the world, a place where I could be useful, even if no one else noticed. But I did. I noticed the way Maggie would slip me an extra coffee refill when the morning rush was done, or how Henry would nod in approval when I managed to scrub a pan so clean it shone like new. Those small gestures felt like a kind of acceptance, something I'd never known in my father's house. Still, I knew dishwashing wasn't the life I wanted forever. Each night, after the last busboy had left and the kitchen had gone silent, I sat in my tiny room with the cracked plaster walls and the worn-out mattress, thinking about what came next. I knew I had to find something that would last longer than a shift at a greasy spoon. One evening, while walking back from the diner, I saw a flyer taped to a street lamp, fluttering in the breeze. Trade program enrollment. Learn a skill, build a future. The words felt like a dare, like a promise that maybe there was a path forward after all. My father had always said that real men built their futures with their hands, but he'd never let me see what that meant for myself. I wanted to know. I took the number scrawled at the bottom of the flyer and called the next day on my lunch break, my hands still damp from scrubbing dishes. The woman on the other end had a warm voice, patient and kind. She told me about the program. A few months of hard training, but at the end of it, I'd have a skill that no one could take away from me. I chose plumbing, something solid, something real, pipes and valves, water and pressure. It was work that didn't need my father's approval. It was work that mattered because it kept the world running, and it was something I could be proud of. The classes started at night, after my shifts at the diner. I'd rush straight from the steamy kitchen to the small, dusty classroom in an old warehouse on the edge of town. The instructor, a gruff man named Joe, taught us everything from the basics of water pressure to the quiet satisfaction of fixing a leak that no one else could. His hands were scarred and strong, his voice calm and steady. He taught like he lived, and I soaked up every word. At first, it was hard. My mind felt slow, weighed down by exhaustion and doubt. I'd never been a great student, and the numbers and diagrams on the chalkboard made my head spin. But I kept at it. Every night, I took notes until my fingers cramped, practicing pipe cuts and fitting joints until my knuckles were raw. The others in the class came from every corner of life, some fresh out of high school, others older than me, each carrying their own story of why they needed a second chance. In that room, we were all just people trying to carve out a future for ourselves, and for once, I didn't feel like I was pretending to belong. Some nights, when I finally made it back to my room, I'd collapse onto the mattress without even taking off my boots. But even then, I felt something shifting inside me. My father's words still echoed in the back of my mind, but they felt smaller now, like distant thunder instead of the storm that had once consumed me. One night, Joe pulled me aside after class. "You've got good hands," he said, his eyes sharp under the flickering light. "Steady. You don't give up easy. That's what it takes." I swallowed hard, not sure what to say. I'd never had anyone tell me I was good at something, certainly not my father. But Joe didn't seem to need an answer. He just clapped me on the shoulder and went back to packing up his tools. That moment stuck with me, a quiet seed of confidence I hadn't known I needed. Each day, I started to believe that maybe I wasn't as worthless as I'd been made to feel. Maybe I could build something real, one copper pipe, one tightened bolt at a time. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months. My world became a blur of dishwater and pipe fittings, of clattering plates and whirring saws. I worked and studied and learned to find small victories in every clean dish and every perfectly cut pipe. And slowly, almost without realizing it, I started to feel like a man who was more than just someone's disappointment. I didn't have much, no fancy house, no big job title. But each time I turned a wrench or cleaned a plate to a shine, I felt like I was reclaiming a piece of myself. My father's house, with its grand halls and expensive paintings, felt 1,000 miles away, like a dream that had lost its power to haunt me. I still thought about him sometimes, about the way he'd looked at me that night I left. But those thoughts didn't cut as deep as they once had. Because now, when I looked in the mirror, I didn't see his failure. I saw my own quiet triumphs, built with hands that refused to stay idle. I wasn't sure where it would all lead, but I knew this much. I was done measuring my worth by anyone else's standards. I was building a life that was mine alone, and that was enough to keep me going. As I lay down to sleep, the hum of distant trains carried me off, their rhythmic clatter a reminder that the world kept turning, and so would I. Tomorrow, there would be more dishes, more pipes, more small moments of progress. And for now, that was all I needed. I was finishing a late-night shift at the diner when my phone buzzed in my pocket, rattling against my leg like a wasp trapped in a jar. It was late, the kitchen was empty, and the fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead. I pulled off my cracked rubber gloves and checked the screen. An unfamiliar number glowed in the dim light. I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the answer button. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to let the call slip into the silence of the night. But curiosity got the better of me, and I pressed the phone to my ear. "Hello," I said, my voice hoarse from hours of kitchen steam and hard work. There was a pause, just long enough to make my stomach clench. Then, a voice I hadn't heard in months, thin and trembling. "It's me," my mother said quietly. I closed my eyes, leaning back against the wall, the damp air heavy around me. "Your father, he's lost everything. The business, the house, it's all gone." For a moment, I said nothing. I let the words settle over me like snow, cold and soft. Part of me had expected this in some deep, unspoken way. My father had always been too proud to admit the cracks in his empire, too stubborn to ask for help until the floor fell out from beneath him. How did it happen? I asked, though I already knew. My father's pride was a fragile thing, and pride doesn't pay the bills. "He took some bad loans," my mother said, her voice breaking. "Thought he could fix it all himself, like always. But it got too big. They took the house today." She let out a small sob, muffled by the distance of the line. I pressed my hand against the cool tile of the wall, feeling the rough texture beneath my fingertips. I thought about the house I'd grown up in, with its heavy doors and dark wood floors, how those halls had always felt like they belonged to him, not to any of us. Now it was just another empty shell, stripped of the illusions it once held. "I'm sorry, Ma," I said softly, though I wasn't sure what I was apologizing for. Sorry for the mess he'd made, for the way he'd driven me out, for the pieces she'd been left to gather on her own. He's asking for you," she said after a moment. My chest tightened at the thought. He won't say it, but he's scared. He's lost, and he doesn't know what to do. I closed my eyes again, the memory of his last words to me, "You're no son of mine," echoing in the quiet of the kitchen. The anger was still there, buried deep like an ember, but it didn't burn as hot as it once had. In its place was something colder, more measured. I didn't owe him anything. I'd built this life with my own two hands, without him. But still, he was my father. And for all his failures, he was the only one I'd ever had. "I don't know, Ma," I said finally. "I don't know if I can help him." "I understand," she said softly, and I believed her. I thought you should know." We said our goodbyes, and the line went dead. I stood there for a while, the phone still pressed to my ear, the weight of that call settling into my bones. The diner was quiet, the smell of old coffee and bleach filling the air. Outside, the streets were empty, the world asleep. I thought about all the nights I'd spent in that house, every argument, every hollow promise. I thought about how I'd left with nothing, and how, somehow, I'd found a way to keep going. I didn't know if I could face him again, if I could look into his eyes and see the same man who'd once told me I was worthless. But I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't the same boy who had left that night, bag slung over his shoulder and heart in his throat. I'd earned every scar, every callus, every small victory. The next morning, I went to work as usual. Maggie took one look at me and didn't ask any questions. She just poured me a cup of coffee and gave me a small, understanding smile. Henry barked orders from the kitchen, and the clatter of plates and silverware filled the air. For a few hours, I lost myself in the work, letting the rhythm of scrubbing and stacking drown out the noise in my head. But by the end of the shift, I knew what I had to do. I couldn't change what he'd done, couldn't undo the years of silence and hurt. But I could face him, not as a son desperate for approval, but as a man who'd learned to stand on his own. That afternoon, I packed a small bag. I didn't need much, just a change of clothes and the quiet certainty that no matter what waited for me at that house, it couldn't take away the strength I'd found in the life I'd built. The journey home felt longer than it should have, every mile a reminder of the distance I'd put between who I was and who I'd become. As the bus rattled down familiar streets, I saw the hollowed-out shell of my father's business, windows dark and cold. It didn't hurt the way I thought it would. Instead, I felt free. When I finally stood on the cracked front steps of that house, I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the past pressing against me. I didn't know what I'd find inside, but I knew this much. Whatever happened next, I would walk through that door on my own terms. I knocked once, the sound echoing in the quiet afternoon. My mother opened the door, her eyes red but warm. She stepped aside without a word, and I stepped across the threshold, the weight of the years falling away with each step. Stepping into that house felt like walking through a doorway to another life. Everything was the same, the heavy curtains, the smell of old wood and stale air, but everything had changed. I saw the wear in the carpet, the hollow silence that clung to the walls like dust. My mother closed the door gently behind me, her eyes searching my face as if to make sure I was really there. "He's in the study," she said quietly. "He's not the same." I nodded, though my stomach twisted at the thought. I took a deep breath and walked down the narrow hallway, my footsteps muffled by the faded runner. The door to his study was half open, and I could see him inside, hunched over the desk where he'd once built empires from nothing but determination and raw will. His hair was thinner, streaked with gray, and his shoulders slumped in a way I'd never seen before. The man who'd once filled every room with his presence looked small, almost fragile. For a moment, I stood there, watching him. He didn't see me at first, his gaze fixed on the papers spread out before him, old bills, court notices, remnants of a life that had slipped through his fingers. When he finally looked up, his eyes met mine and something flickered there. Regret, maybe, or just the raw, human fear of a man who'd built his identity on power and control, only to find himself adrift when it all vanished. "You came," he said, his voice rasping like dry leaves. There was no anger in it, no thunder, just weariness. I stepped into the room, closing the door behind me. "I did," I said simply. I didn't owe him an explanation. I didn't owe him anything at all. But still, I'd come. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The air was heavy with the weight of everything that had passed between us, years of silence, of disappointment and pride. Finally, he cleared his throat, his hands trembling as he reached for a worn envelope on the desk. "It's all gone," he said, his voice breaking. "The business, the house, everything I built." He looked at me then, really looked, and I saw the same hard lines in his face that I'd once tried so hard to erase from mine. I thought I was doing it for you, for the family. But maybe I was just trying to prove something to myself. I didn't know what to say to that. Part of me wanted to tell him that he'd never done it for me, that all I'd ever wanted was a father who saw me for who I was. But the words caught in my throat. In the end, I just nodded. "I know," I said quietly. He sat back, his shoulders slumping even more. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he said, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "I don't even know if I deserve it." I took a deep breath, feeling the steady thump of my heart in my chest. "I didn't come here to forgive you," I said. My voice was calm, steady in a way it had never been around him before. "I came because I needed to see it for myself. To see that I could stand here, in this house, and not be broken by it." He looked at me then, really looked, and for the first time, I think he saw me. Not the son who'd disappointed him, not the reflection of his own failures, but a man who had learned how to stand on his own. "I'm proud of what I've built," I said, and the words felt like a quiet triumph. "I've got nothing fancy, no empire, no titles, but it's mine. Every inch of it, I earned myself, and that's enough." He nodded slowly, a single tear slipping down his cheek. "I see that now," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I see you." I didn't stay long. There was nothing left to say, no grand reconciliation to be had. I stood, gave my mother a small, reassuring smile, and turned to leave. As I stepped back into the hallway, I felt lighter than I had in years. The house that had once felt like a prison was just a building now, nothing more. Outside, the sun was setting, the sky streaked with the soft glow of twilight. I walked down the cracked front steps and into the cooling evening air, my breath fogging in the fading light. I felt the weight of the past slip away with every step, replaced by something solid and quiet inside me. I didn't know what would come next. The road ahead was still uncertain, full of challenges and small triumphs yet to be earned. But I knew one thing. I didn't need my father's approval to keep going. I didn't need his name or his pride to define who I was. I was more than the sum of his expectations. I was the man I'd fought to become, dishwater and sweat, calloused hands and quiet nights of study. A man who knew that real strength wasn't measured in empires or titles, but in the simple, stubborn act of getting back up, over and over again. As I walked away from that house for the last time, I felt a smile tug at the corners of my lips. Not out of spite or triumph, but out of the quiet certainty that I was finally, truly free. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, comment, and share it with others who might find strength in its message. Subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories, and join our community where every voice matters and every story finds a home.